Hurry up with the inheritance. I'm already making plans, Lindsay whispered beside the casket, believing no one could hear her over the organ music. Margaret Whitmore did not turn around. She stood perfectly still at the front of St. Andrew's Chapel, her gloved hands folded over the small black program that listed her husband's name in bold print. Daniel Whitmore, 1949 to 2024. The late morning light filtered through stained glass, scattering muted shades of blue and crimson across the polished wooden floor, and for a brief moment the colors rested against the edge of Daniel's mahogany casket as if the world itself were offering a final blessing. The scent of white lilies hung thick in the air, almost sweet enough to make breathing feel like work. Margaret had chosen those lilies herself 2 days earlier, standing in the florist's cooler while a young assistant asked gentle questions about arrangements and ribbon colors. 47 years of marriage had ended in a hospital room less than 5 miles from the home they had shared for more than 3 decades, and now she stood in heels that pinched her feet, greeting neighbors, shaking hands, nodding quietly as casseroles and condolences blurred together into one long murmur of sympathy. She had expected grief to come in waves. She had not expected calculation to echo behind her husband's casket. Lindsay's voice, low but urgent, drifted again from somewhere near the second pew. Once probate clears, we can finally move forward. Margaret's pulse did not quicken. Her shoulders did not tense. Instead, she adjusted the thin veil attached to her hat and stepped closer to the casket, resting her fingertips lightly against the smooth wood. Daniel had always admired restraint. Never let them see you unravel, he used to say when business negotiations grew tense at the lake house each summer. That lake house had been their pride, a cedar-sided retreat 2 hours north where Daniel spent weekends repairing the dock plank by plank and teaching their son, Ethan, how to cast a fishing line before he was tall enough to see over the railing. Margaret remembered the smell of sunscreen and grilled corn, the sound of loons on early mornings, the steady comfort of Daniel's hand at the small of her back as guests arrived for 4th of July barbecues. She wondered now how long Lindsay had been measuring those memories in square footage and resale value. A line of mourners waited to pay their respects, and Margaret lifted her chin, offering each person a composed smile that did not quite reach her pale blue eyes. Ethan stood near the entrance, his dark suit hanging loosely on his broad frame, his expression distant and unreadable. He had always been sensitive as a boy, easily swayed by stronger personalities, eager to keep the peace at any cost. Margaret had once thought marriage would steady him. Instead, as she listened to the soft scrape of heels against tile and the faint rustle of whispered plans behind her, she understood that this funeral was not only a farewell. It was a reveal. And while others saw a grieving widow in black, Margaret felt something else settle quietly inside her. Not anger, not yet, but clarity as sharp and cold as the January wind waiting outside the chapel doors. After the final hymn faded and the last handshake loosened from her grip, Margaret followed the slow procession out into the gray afternoon, where the January air carried a brittle chill that settled deep into her lungs. The cemetery stretched across rolling acres at the edge of town, rows of granite markers aligned with careful symmetry, each one bearing dates that told entire lifetimes in a pair of numbers separated by a dash. She walked beside the hearse without leaning on anyone, her heels sinking slightly into the damp winter grass, her posture upright in a way that felt almost ceremonial. Ethan stayed close, his hand hovering near her elbow as if unsure whether comfort was welcome or required, while Lindsay moved ahead to speak with the funeral director, her voice lowered into a tone of practical efficiency. Margaret noticed the way Lindsay checked her phone between condolences, her thumb scrolling briefly before she slipped it back into her black clutch. It was a small movement, almost invisible, yet it felt louder than the crunch of gravel beneath the mourner's shoes. When they reached the gravesite, the wind lifted the edge of Margaret's veil and brushed it against her cheek. She remembered standing in that same cemetery 20 years earlier for Daniel's father, remembered how Daniel had wrapped his coat around her shoulders even though she had insisted she was not cold. Now there was no coat to share, no steady hand at her back. The pastor spoke about legacy and love, about the measure of a life not in dollars but in devotion, and Margaret listened with an expression that revealed nothing. The words inheritance and estate were never spoken aloud, yet they seemed to linger in the air like an uninvited echo. As the casket was lowered, she felt the finality of the motion not as a dramatic collapse of emotion, but as a tightening in her chest, a recognition that the man who had balanced the checkbook at the kitchen table every Sunday night would never sit there again. She had watched Daniel review documents with quiet concentration over the past year, updating policies, speaking with their attorney in the den with the door closed but not locked. He had told her more than once that preparation was a form of protection. At the time, she believed he was protecting her from uncertainty. Now she wondered if he had also been protecting her from ambition. After the brief reception in the church hall, where coffee cooled untouched in white paper cups and neighbors offered to bring dinners she would not eat, Margaret noticed Lindsay gathering a small circle near the window. The conversation paused when Margaret approached, replaced instantly by sympathetic nods and soft assurances about family unity. Margaret accepted each word with a gentle inclination of her head. She did not confront. She did not question. Instead, she committed every glance, every shift in tone, every unfinished sentence to memory. The earth had been covered neatly over Daniel's grave by the time they drove home, and as the car turned into the familiar driveway of the colonial house on Maple Ridge Road, Margaret felt something settle within her, firm and deliberate. Grief remained, heavy and undeniable, but beneath it ran a quiet resolve. Whatever plans were being made would not unfold without her awareness, and whatever Daniel had prepared in those closed-door conversations would soon come to light. The house on Maple Ridge Road felt larger that evening than it had that morning, as if the absence of one man had expanded every hallway and deepened every shadow. Margaret stepped inside first, removing her black gloves with slow precision and placing them on the narrow entry table beside a framed photograph of Daniel taken the summer before his diagnosis. In the picture, he stood on the dock at the lake house, sunburned and smiling, a fishing rod balanced casually over his shoulder. She traced the edge of the frame with her finger, then walked into the kitchen where the scent of brewed coffee still lingered from neighbors who had stopped by earlier in the week. Ethan loosened his tie and sank into a chair at the breakfast table, staring at the wood grain as though it might offer instruction. Lindsay moved through the space with an energy that did not match the heaviness of the day, opening cabinets to store catering trays, stacking disposable plates, straightening items that did not need straightening. "We should probably schedule the meeting with Mr. Benson soon," she said, her tone measured but firm. "The estate process can take months, and it is better to stay ahead of it." Margaret poured herself a glass of water before answering, allowing the quiet hum of the refrigerator to fill the space between them. "Your father was never careless with paperwork," she said gently to Ethan, her voice calm and even. "He believed in order." Ethan nodded, rubbing his temples. "I know, Mom. Lindsay is just trying to help keep things organized." Margaret watched the exchange without expression. She noticed how Lindsay's hand rested lightly on Ethan's shoulder, how her gaze flickered toward Margaret to assess the reaction. It was subtle, practiced, almost polite. Later, when the house grew quiet and the dishes were washed, Margaret climbed the staircase to the bedroom she had shared with Daniel for nearly half a century. The room carried the faint scent of his aftershave, a clean cedar note that lingered in the air despite the open window. She sat at his desk in the corner, where neatly labeled folders remained stacked in a leather organizer. Daniel had always kept copies of financial statements in chronological order, each page aligned with careful symmetry. Margaret opened the top drawer and found a sealed envelope addressed in Daniel's steady handwriting. "Margaret, to be opened when the time is right." Her heart did not race. Instead, a slow clarity spread through her thoughts. She remembered the way Daniel had insisted on installing security cameras around the lake house after a minor break-in 2 summers ago, how he had explained that precaution was not pessimism, but wisdom. Downstairs, she could hear Lindsay's soft voice drifting through the vents as she spoke to someone on the phone, her words indistinct, but her tone animated. Margaret did not need to catch every sentence to understand the momentum building beneath the surface. She closed the drawer gently without breaking the seal on the envelope and stood, smoothing the front of her dress. Whatever conversations were taking place in hushed tones would soon meet the quiet preparation Daniel had left behind. And for the first time since the morning, Margaret allowed herself a small, controlled exhale, not of surrender but of patience. Morning arrived quietly over Maple Ridge Road. a pale winter light slipping through the bedroom curtains and stretching across the hardwood floors. Margaret woke before the alarm clock that Daniel had once insisted on setting every night out of habit, even after retirement. The house did not echo with his footsteps anymore. It did not hum with the low murmur of morning news drifting from the den. Instead, there was only the faint sound of the furnace turning on and off, steady and indifferent. She dressed in a soft gray sweater and pressed slacks, choosing clothing that felt composed rather than mournful. In the kitchen, she measured coffee grounds with the same stainless steel scoop Daniel had used for years, leveling it carefully against the rim of the container. Ritual, she reminded herself, was a form of steadiness. Ethan came downstairs mid-morning, his expression drawn from lack of sleep. Lindsay followed moments later, already dressed in tailored black slacks and a cream blouse that suggested productivity rather than grief. She carried a leather planner tucked under her arm. "I called Mr. Benson's office," Lindsay announced while pouring herself coffee. "He can see us tomorrow at 10 in the morning to discuss the estate timeline." Margaret stirred her cup slowly, the spoon touching porcelain in soft, deliberate circles. "That is very efficient," she said. Ethan looked between them, uncertain. "Mom, it is just paperwork. It does not mean anything else." Margaret offered him a small nod. "Paperwork always means something, Ethan. Your father understood that." She did not raise her voice. She did not challenge. Instead, she observed. Lindsay spoke about property taxes on the lake house, about maintenance costs and market value trends in the county. She referenced square footage and recent sales within a 10-mile radius, as if discussing a renovation project already underway. Margaret noticed how naturally the words rolled off her tongue, how she referred to the property as an asset rather than a memory. After breakfast, Margaret excused herself and returned upstairs. She opened the drawer once more and lifted the sealed envelope Daniel had left behind. This time she turned it over in her hands, feeling the weight of the paper inside. Daniel had never been impulsive. He planned vacations months in advance, kept receipts filed by year, reviewed insurance policies every January without fail. If he had written something for her to read when the time was right, then he had done so with intention. Downstairs, Lindsay's voice rose slightly as she spoke on the phone again, discussing appointment times and documents to bring. Margaret walked to the window overlooking the backyard where the maple trees stood bare against the winter sky. She remembered Daniel's words from the previous autumn when he had insisted on updating certain accounts despite her reassurance that everything was fine. "Preparation is not fear," he had told her. "It is responsibility." Margaret finally broke the seal of the envelope with steady fingers and unfolded the single sheet inside. As her eyes moved across the page, her expression did not change, but something within her aligned. The quiet patience she had carried since the chapel settled into something firmer. Whatever expectations were forming downstairs were built on assumptions, and Margaret understood, with calm certainty, that assumptions were often the first mistake. The letter Daniel had written was brief, direct, and unmistakably deliberate. Margaret read it twice before folding it carefully along its original crease. In his steady handwriting, he explained that he had amended his estate 6 months earlier, not out of distrust, but out of clarity. He had transferred the lake house into an irrevocable trust under Margaret's sole authority, with specific conditions that would delay any sale or transfer of ownership for 5 years unless she personally approved it in writing. He had also added a provision requiring that all financial distributions be reviewed by Mr. Benson in person, not through proxies or secondary requests. Daniel had underlined one sentence in particular. "Do not let urgency rush you into decisions that cannot be undone." Margaret placed the letter back inside its envelope and returned it to the drawer, not out of secrecy, but out of timing. Downstairs, she could hear Lindsay moving through the living room, her heels tapping against the hardwood as she rearranged framed photographs on the mantel. Margaret descended the staircase with measured steps and paused in the doorway. Lindsay was holding a photograph from the lake house, studying it with narrowed focus. "I thought we might freshen this space up a little," she said lightly, setting the frame down. "It might be good for everyone to feel a sense of renewal." Margaret walked into the room and adjusted the photograph back to its original angle. "Renewal takes time," she replied gently, "and sometimes stillness is more respectful." Ethan entered moments later, carrying a folder of documents he had gathered from Daniel's office. He looked tired but hopeful, as though organization might restore a sense of control. "I found some account summaries," he said. "Maybe we can review them tonight before we see Mr. Benson tomorrow." Margaret met his gaze with calm steadiness. "There will be plenty of time for review," she said. "Your father never left loose ends." Lindsay smiled, but the smile did not fully reach her eyes. "That is exactly why we should stay proactive," she answered. "Real estate markets shift quickly." Margaret noticed the subtle emphasis on the word markets. She moved toward the window where winter sunlight filtered across the rug, illuminating faint patterns in the fabric Daniel had chosen years ago. "Your father did not build his life on market shifts," she said quietly. "He built it on patience." The room fell silent for a brief moment. Lindsay cleared her throat and gathered her planner. "Tomorrow will give us clarity," she said, already turning toward the kitchen. Margaret watched her go, her expression unchanged. Clarity had already arrived, sealed in an envelope upstairs. The meeting with Mr. Benson would not be about discovery. It would be about revelation. And Margaret intended to let the truth unfold at its own measured pace, without interruption, without confrontation, and without haste. The next morning arrived with a thin layer of frost clinging to the edges of the driveway, and Margaret stood by the front window for a moment before they left, watching Ethan scrape ice from the windshield of his sedan in slow, distracted strokes. Lindsay waited in the passenger seat, reviewing notes inside her leather planner, her expression focused and composed. Margaret gathered her coat and gloves with unhurried precision, then stepped outside into the sharp air that carried the faint scent of pine from neighboring yards. The drive to Mr. Benson's office took just under 20 minutes, passing familiar storefronts and the public library where Daniel had once served on the board. Margaret noticed how ordinary everything appeared, how the world continued its rhythm without pause, as if nothing had shifted. When they arrived, Mr. Benson's building stood quiet and formal, its brick exterior softened by winter sunlight. Inside, the receptionist greeted them in a hushed tone appropriate for recent loss, and they were guided into a conference room with polished wood furniture and neatly stacked folders at the center of the table. Mr. Benson entered with steady professionalism, offering condolences before taking his seat. Ethan leaned forward immediately, hands clasped together. Lindsay placed her planner beside her, pen poised as though attending a business strategy meeting. Margaret folded her hands in her lap and listened. Mr. Benson began outlining the estate structure, explaining that Daniel had updated several components within the past year, including the creation of a trust arrangement for specific properties. Lindsay's pen paused midair. "The lake house?" she asked smoothly. Mr. Benson adjusted his glasses. "Yes. The lake house has been transferred into an irrevocable trust under Mrs. Whitmore's sole authority. Any decisions regarding its use or future disposition require her explicit written consent, and there is a 5-year holding condition unless extraordinary circumstances apply." The room grew still in a way that was not dramatic but unmistakable. Ethan turned toward his mother, surprise flickering across his face. "Mom, did you know?" Margaret met his gaze evenly. "Your father believed in preparation," she said calmly. Lindsay's expression remained composed, though her fingers tightened slightly around her pen. "That seems unusually restrictive," she remarked. "We were hoping to explore options sooner rather than later." Mr. Benson nodded politely. Daniel was clear about his intentions. He wanted to ensure stability during a period of transition. Margaret did not speak again for several moments. She simply allowed the information to settle in the room, heavy and undeniable. The assumptions that had floated quietly beneath whispered conversations were now confronted by documented fact. As Mr. Benson continued explaining distribution timelines and review protocols, Margaret felt no triumph, only steadiness. Daniel had anticipated more than illness. He had anticipated pressure. When the meeting concluded, Lindsay gathered her planner without comment, and Ethan walked beside his mother down the hallway in thoughtful silence. Outside, the winter air felt less sharp than before. Margaret paused briefly on the steps of the building, looking up at the pale sky. Preparation, she understood now, was not about control. It was about protection. And for the first time since the chapel, she sensed the ground beneath her feet settle into something solid and secure. The drive home unfolded in near silence, the kind that did not erupt into argument, but settled like dust over unspoken expectations. Ethan kept his eyes on the road, his jaw set in quiet concentration, while Lindsay stared out the passenger window with measured composure. Margaret sat in the back seat, observing the subtle shifts in posture and breath that spoke louder than any raised voice. When they reached the house, Lindsay stepped out first, closing the car door with more firmness than necessary before walking ahead without waiting. Inside, the air felt warmer than the morning, though the tension beneath it had cooled into something sharper. Ethan placed the folder of documents on the kitchen counter and exhaled slowly. "I did not realize Dad had changed that much," he said, running a hand through his hair. "He did not tell me." Margaret removed her coat and hung it neatly in the closet. "Your father did not always explain his reasoning," she replied gently. "He preferred results to discussions." Lindsay entered the kitchen moments later, her expression carefully neutral. "It is just disappointing," she said, leaning lightly against the counter. "We were thinking long-term, planning responsibly." Margaret poured 3 glasses of water and set one before each of them, her movements unhurried. "Long-term planning requires patience," she said. 5 years can pass more quickly than you expect." Lindsay's eyes flickered, calculating. "Real estate does not wait," she responded. "Holding property can mean lost opportunity." Margaret met her gaze evenly. Opportunity for whom? The question lingered in the air, not accusatory but precise. Ethan shifted in his seat, discomfort evident in the tightening of his shoulders. "Lindsay just wants what is best for everyone," he said quickly. Margaret nodded once. "Then everyone must be included in the definition of best." She did not elaborate. She did not need to. That afternoon, Lindsay retreated to the guest bedroom to make phone calls, her voice low and urgent behind a closed door. Ethan remained in the living room, staring at the blank television screen as though expecting clarity to appear across it. Margaret walked upstairs to Daniel's office and opened the leather binder he had kept beside his desk. Inside were neatly tabbed sections labeled insurance, trust, contingency, each page organized with careful precision. Daniel had anticipated more than illness. He had anticipated impatience. Margaret traced the margin of one document where Daniel had written a small note in blue ink. Stability first, emotion second. She closed the binder gently and returned downstairs. The house did not feel fragile anymore. It felt defined. Whatever assumptions had once lingered in whispered tones now met boundaries drawn in ink and law. Margaret moved through the rooms with quiet assurance, adjusting nothing, rearranging nothing, simply occupying the space that had always been hers. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the yard, stretching toward evening. Inside, patience held its ground. The days that followed did not explode into confrontation. Instead, they thinned out into a quiet recalibration of space and expectation. Margaret noticed how Lindsay's conversations shifted in tone, less certain now, more exploratory. Phone calls that had once carried the confident rhythm of assumed outcomes grew shorter, punctuated by longer pauses. Ethan returned to work midweek, grateful perhaps for the structure of his office and the distraction of routine. Margaret remained in the house, moving through it with deliberate steadiness, neither retreating nor asserting, simply present. One afternoon, as pale sunlight filtered across the dining room table, Lindsay approached her with a folder in hand. "I have been reviewing the tax implications," she began carefully. "Holding the lake property in a trust could create inefficiencies. There might be alternatives if you are open to discussion." Margaret folded the linen napkin she had been smoothing and placed it beside her teacup. "Alternatives suggest urgency," she replied evenly. "Your father did not act out of urgency." Lindsay inhaled slowly, maintaining composure. "It is not about urgency. It is about maximizing value." Margaret studied her for a moment, noting the faint tension in her jaw, the practiced calm that no longer felt effortless. "Value is not always measured in market terms," she said. "Sometimes it is measured in time." The conversation ended there, not with agreement, but with boundary. That evening, Margaret drove alone to the lake house, a 2-hour trip north along familiar highways lined with dormant cornfields and bare oak trees. The cabin stood quiet against the shoreline, its cedars siding weathered, but solid. She unlocked the door and stepped inside, greeted by the faint scent of wood and lake water that had lingered for decades. Sunlight stretched across the worn leather sofa, where Daniel had once sat reviewing invoices and fishing reports. Margaret walked onto the dock, the boards cool beneath her boots, and looked out across the still water. 5 years, she thought. 5 years was not a sentence. It was space. Space to grieve without negotiation. Space to remember without calculation. When she returned home the following day, she carried with her not papers or plans, but something steadier. Lindsay watched her arrival from the kitchen window, curiosity evident but restrained. "How was it?" she asked. Margaret removed her coat and met her gaze without hesitation. "It remains exactly as it should," she answered. There was no challenge in her tone, no accusation, only certainty. The assumptions that once moved confidently through whispered conversations had encountered a boundary they could not easily cross. And Margaret understood that patience was not passive. It was strategic. Daniel had prepared the structure. She would uphold it. Whatever ambitions lingered in softened tones would have to wait for a clock that Margaret alone controlled. Winter slowly gave way to early spring, and with it the sharp edges of immediate grief softened into something quieter and more deliberate. The maple trees along Maple Ridge Road began to show faint buds, small signs of renewal that did not demand attention but promised continuity. Inside the house, the rhythm of daily life resumed in measured steps. Ethan returned each evening with the steady fatigue of work, his conversations less centered on property and more on projects and clients. Lindsay, once so eager to discuss market forecasts and renovation plans, grew more restrained. She still maintained her composure, still carried her planner from room to room, but the urgency that had once defined her tone had thinned into cautious calculation. Margaret noticed the shift without commenting on it. She moved through the home with the assurance of someone who no longer felt the need to defend her presence. One Sunday afternoon, Ethan joined her on the back patio where she had begun tending the small garden Daniel had planted years ago. The soil was dark and cool beneath her gloves as she pressed new seedlings into the earth. "I did not realize how much Dad handled quietly," Ethan said, watching her work. "There were things I assumed would just continue the way we imagined." Margaret brushed dirt from her hands and looked at him gently. "Assumptions are comfortable," she replied. "But your father believed in certainty." Ethan nodded, thoughtful rather than defensive. "Lindsay has been rethinking some of her plans," he added. "She said maybe waiting is not the worst thing." Margaret allowed a faint smile to touch her lips. "Waiting is not weakness," she said. "It is often wisdom." The lake house remained untouched, its dock steady against the shoreline, its windows reflecting the quiet water beyond. Margaret visited once a month, sometimes alone, sometimes with Ethan, never with urgency and never with negotiation. The trust documents rested securely with Mr. Benson, their language clear and unambiguous. No dramatic confrontation had occurred. No raised voices had shattered the air. Instead, boundaries had been drawn in ink and upheld in silence. Lindsay's ambition had not vanished, but it had met resistance in the form of patience she could not easily outmaneuver. One evening, as Margaret sat in the living room beneath the soft glow of a floor lamp Daniel had chosen decades earlier, she felt neither victory nor bitterness. She felt steadiness. The whisper she had once overheard in a chapel no longer echoed with power. It had been reduced to what it truly was, an assumption spoken too soon. Daniel had prepared for uncertainty. Margaret had upheld his preparation, and in doing so, she had not raised her voice, not demanded apology, not sought confrontation. She had simply remained. In the quiet structure he left behind, she found not only protection but clarity. Some legacies are not measured by inheritance alone. Some are measured by the strength to wait, to endure, and to let truth reveal itself without force. In that patience, Margaret understood, she had already secured what mattered most.